The Battle of Antietam had begun in the fields north of Sharpsburg, between the Confederate forces led by General Robert E. Lee and the Union soldiers under General George McClellan. At first, the Confederates had successfully held off the Union attack, but as the morning dawned, their line began buckling, and defeat seemed on the brink of the horizon. Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any future video ideas for this channel, please comment them below. At 7 a.m., as Major General Thomas Jackson's men were on the brink of collapse, timely reinforcements came with the dawning of the sun. Lee moved multiple regiments from his center to his left flank, while more men arrived from nearby cities, bolstering the Confederate lines. With the arrival of additional soldiers, Jackson launched a counterattack, and his men pushed back through the cornfield and the woods, driving the Union soldiers back and successfully regaining much of their lost ground. However, losses were considerable upon both sides, with some regiments suffering as much as 60% casualties during the savage battle. Hooker, having fallen back to where he had started that morning, rallied his men together and summoned multiple divisions from the rear of the army. With his host thoroughly reinforced, he pushed back towards the Confederates, and bloody close-range battles broke out again in and around the cornfield. This second drive, however, had a positive effect for the Union side, and the Confederate line was breached in multiple points on their right flank, causing Jackson to pull his men back in the direction of the West Woods. Their retreat was in good order, however, and an attempt by Hooker to turn their right flank failed badly and caused dire losses. Around 11 a.m., as the Union soldiers on the left stalemated with their opposing forces in the West Woods, a savage battle was raging on the center of the battlefield. After an entire morning of skirmishing, the arrival of additional reinforcements on both sides intensified the action. The Second Corps, led by Major General Edwin Sumner, attacked the Confederate center, composed of Jackson and Longstreet's men. The Confederate soldiers were dug in along a sunken road, which was to be known as Bloody Lane, and despite being outnumbered heavily by their enemies, they held their strong positions well, inflicting deadly casualties upon Sumner's men. For nearly an hour, the Confederates held their ground, successfully stalling the advance of an entire Union corps, but at length, around midday, the tide began turning. The Confederate line was punctured by Sumner's men at multiple points, and the Union soldiers poured through the breaches in the thousands. With their line broken, the Confederate formation collapsed, and soldiers fled back in a swift rout towards Sharpsburg. The Union regiments pursued swiftly, and the entire battle seemed lost for Lee and his men. However, at that crucial moment, Longstreet gathered together multiple cannons and fired into the ranks of Sumner's men. The ferocious bombardment halted the Union advance, and with a few fresh regiments, Longstreet ordered a counterattack, rallying together the broken Confederate line. They were able to drive back Sumner's men all the way back to the sunken lane, with both sides suffering detrimental casualties. However, this engagement left the Confederate center in a disorganized and weakened state, and McClellan was once again given a ripe opportunity to exploit his enemy's weakness and obtain a much-needed victory. His irresolution and overcaution, however, ruined another chance, and he ordered his men to hold, fearing a trap and a counterattack. As a stalemate was reached on the northern side of the battlefield, the battle began raging fiercely on the eastern front. The Union attack from the north, having successfully weakened the Confederate forces defending the Antietam Creek from the eastern heights of Sharpsburg, now gave General Burnside a chance to drive back his vastly outnumbered enemies and take the fords across the creek. For most of the morning, he had been passive about attacking, but now, pressured by McClellan, he ordered an attack. Burnside committed all of his forces in a storm across the bridge at the center of the battlefield, which was to be named Burnside's Bridge. With Confederate soldiers dug in securely on the hills facing the bridge, it was not an easy target. Burnside, however, entirely neglected the fact that the creek was waist deep at multiple points, and that he could have avoided much less casualties if he had taken full advantage of them. At around 12:30 p.m., the Union soldiers drove across Burnside's bridge and a few smaller fords downstream. The Confederates opened fire down the slopes of the hill and battered the Union regiments attempting to cross, driving back many and inflicting dire casualties upon them. At the same time, sharpshooters picked off officers from afar. For nearly an hour, Longstreet's men held off the Union attack, but in the early afternoon, the Confederate soldiers began running out of ammunition. Burnside's soldiers, in the meanwhile, had successfully forded further downstream, and now they attacked the revealed Confederate right flank. Fearing an envelopment, Longstreet's men fell back from the bridge, suffering few casualties themselves after having successfully delayed the Union advance for 3 hours. As Burnside's men slowly crossed the bridge, Lee was given time to assemble a defense upon his crumbling right flank. Playing a daring gamble, he only reinforced his eastern front with a few cannons, hoping that reinforcements he expected would be arriving soon on the field. The delay of the Union advance gave the 3,000 Confederate reinforcements time to arrive, and as Burnside drove westward towards Sharpsburg, hoping to cut off Lee's retreat, a stout defense was mounted against his advancing forces. For an hour and more, the outnumbered Confederates fought a slow retreat back into Sharpsburg, exchanging fire with Burnside's 7,000 men and suffering from enemy artillery fire. A swift advance of Union soldiers, however, struck the already battle-worn Confederate regiments, and small groups of soldiers fled back into Sharpsburg, causing a panic in the town. For the third time that day, Lee seemed on the brink of another catastrophic defeat. At that fateful hour, however, additional Confederate reinforcements arrived, and though still outnumbered, Lee's men launched a surprise attack, and a brigade of South Carolinians drove down upon the weaker left flank of Burnside's advancing host. The inexperienced Union soldiers panicked, and they were routed back towards Burnside's bridge in small groups. Though Burnside could have very well continued his advance, he feared the collapse of his flank, and thus resolved to retreat, pulling back his men to the bridge and ruining yet another ripe opportunity to win the day. This was the final action of the battle. Following Burnside's retreat at around 5:30 p.m., both sides, wearied and battle-worn, stopped the fighting. Over the course of that day, nearly no ground had been gained for either side, and by sunset, they were back roughly where they had started. Lee, expecting an attack the following day, prepared his men in due order, but the attack never came. McClellan, overly cautious and indecisive, refused to launch an assault despite his favorable position, fearing once again that he was outnumbered. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Lee began withdrawing swiftly in the evening of September 18th and back across the Potomac River. The losses of the Battle of Antietam, however, shocked the U.S. public. The Union suffered 10,000 wounded and nearly 3,000 dead. The Confederacy suffered 9,000 wounded and nearly 2,000 dead. It was, and still is, the bloodiest day in American history. The outcome of the battle was unclear. On one hand, Lee's invasion of Maryland had been successfully repulsed, and his army had been battered badly. On the other hand, however, McClellan had failed to deliver a detrimental defeat to the Confederacy, one that his capture of Lee's battle plans should have promised. And General Robert Lee had withdrawn from a nearly impossible situation with his entire army, and together they would live to fight another battle.